at that time, this is late 70s. The largest embassies in Guyana were the Soviet, the Communist Chinese, the North Koreans, and the Cubans, in that order, and then the U.S. Embassy. So you could imagine that there was a lot of intelligence swirling about, and people would be, because it was off the beaten path, people would do things and make liaisons there that they wouldn't make in other places.
Wow.
And so the ambassador would stress quite often how and vital this mission was and our embassy there. And in terms of geopolitics, I suppose it was, but I
Mm.
wasn't involved in all of that.
Right. And so you're a junior enlisted soldier, so I wouldn't expect that you would be in the know about things. But you mentioned these embassies. Um, I was surprised to hear North Korea had an embassy there. Um, and of course, when we think about Jonestown, the whole story of Jonestown, People's Temple, U.S. government, the relationship between the government and People's Temple, Jonestown. One of the questions, of course, that arises has to do with the presence of the CIA in Guyana. I would assume that, of course, there's going to be a CIA presence in Guyana. And as I said, you're a junior enlisted Marine. I don't expect you're going to have inside knowledge, but do you recall just being generally aware, given what you just said, the ambassador is emphasizing the importance of this mission because of geopolitical questions. Do you remember having some maybe even vague awareness that of a CIA presence there around the embassy?
Uh, of course, the stated position of the State Department is they neither confirm nor deny whether there's ever
Sure.
CIA involved. Uh, I would, I'm not so naive as to expect that the CIA wouldn't be interested in Guyana. But truth be told, I can't imagine that they would be all that interested. The country had no vital interest to the U.S. Relative to other countries would be much more vital of interest. And the State Department would handle more things about liaisons with other diplomatic personnel. So I
Okay.
don't think that the CIA would necessarily have had a keen interest in Guyana.
Okay.
Um,
Okay.
so, of course, I have no specific knowledge of that there was any
Right.
CIA presence. And um, well, I guess if you want to talk about the elephant in the room, I've heard rumors and speculations about whether Mr. Dwyer was,
Hmm.
and I can't confirm or deny that, but when I see some of the speculations about it and I read them, I go like, well, these people don't know what they're talking about at all. This is not the man I knew or know, and it
Hmm.
doesn't comport with some of the things I know that are just plain false. So I guess I have to leave it at that. I can't say
Yeah.
yes or no, but
You're referring to Richard Dwyer, the deputy chief of mission there, and we'll come back and talk about him. And as you say, there are some questions about whether he was with CIA.
I try to be a professional, as did all the other Marines that I was with. Were trying to be professionals, and
Mm.
we recognized that it was not part of our need to know who was or
Sure.
was not working in particular functions in the MC. And to speculate would have been unproductive and actually counterproductive. We hadn't. I wouldn't want to know if
Mm.
somebody were, quite frankly, because it would prevent me from doing my job as well.
Mm.
Remember, my job as a Marine Guard was to, what was it to do? To protect the embassy and its personnel. Well, if I had had some special knowledge of, well, this person is special in some particular way, that may color how I would react and handle particular situations, if you can see what I'm saying.
Sure.
So why would I wouldn't want that. I would want to be free from that knowledge so I could act in the best interest of everybody.
You grew up in the Bay Area,
That's
um,
right.
and so even before you got to Guyana, you had heard of People's Temple. You knew of the existence of People's Temple. let's say when you're in Chile, you're still doing embassy duty in Chile. You haven't arrived yet in Guyana. Um, and somebody, somehow the People's Temple comes up. Let's say you're at a restaurant and you're chatting with another Marine, and the Marine says that he saw some newspaper article about this organization in San Francisco called People's Temple. That's going to ring a bell with you at that time. And so I know that these exercises are a little, difficult, and especially after decades, but at that time, what do you imagine you would have said to the Marine, say in 1977, based on just what you'd picked up living in San Francisco about People's Temple?
Oh, well, I would have related how I had heard about them, from various news accounts growing up in the Bay Area. Uh, it was my impression that the People's Temple, particularly Jim Jones, were politically connected, political insiders, and very politically savvy.
Mm.
Uh, my personal assessment at that time would have been that, well, I didn't have any particular uh, high esteem for Mr. Jones because he came across to me as somewhat phony and someone who was exploiting other people and their weaknesses for his own personal aggrandizement and
Mm.
benefit. So I was never particularly impressed by the man. I can appreciate that he was quite sophisticated and cunning, uh, obviously not unintelligent, but not overly uh, competent either.
When you went to Guyana in September 78, did you know that People's Temple had set up a community in that country?
I was aware, I wasn't aware that they had gone to Guyana
No.
until I was, but as soon as I arrived, of course, I heard about them being
Wow.
there.
Mm.
Because being a 900 Americans in the country, this was something that was of obvious interest to the embassy. We had to be concerned about all Americans in the country, regardless of their particular beliefs and feelings. We had a responsibility uh, as the embassy to look after their best interest. And
Mm.
no matter how difficult it would make that for us,
Sure.
that was something that was part of the job.
How would you describe the general sense within the embassy among the Marines with whom you're interacting? You overhear things other people say within the embassy. How would you describe the general sense of things within the embassy of Jonestown? And again, we're speaking, before what happens um, in mid-November.
Hmm.
What, how generally would you describe the sort of the feeling folks had in the embassy about the 900 American community there at Jonestown?
Uh, it was not. There was no hostility. There was more. If there was anything, there was more uh, sadness that we weren't getting along better. We were all Americans, and we respected that we had various opinions and differences of opinions. We wished that we could find a way to make the relationship better with the community there. I
Between
know there
the
were,
relationship between the embassy and Jonestown?
oh yes, yes, they put forth many uh, outreaches towards Jonestown and its members at many times. But you know, there was suspicion on their side, uh, understandably or not, and so it made it difficult. But I I take a different perspective. Is that I think that the embassy staff did their utmost to try to get along and to work with Jonestown and the People's Temple. But it wasn't easy.
Hmm.
And these, I have a high regard for the professionalism of the embassy staff. I think they did with what they had to work with. They were doing yeoman's work. Their hands were tied in many ways because of U.S. State Department policy and government policy. Um, the new policies about respecting of public privacy were coming into vogue in those
Mm,
late 70s. So the kinds of things that we could do, plus working within the constraints that the Guyanese government imposed on, and the physical logistics of the place, made
mm,
it that much more difficult. So I think they did some great work.
yeah.
Unfortunately, well, it didn't work out, well in the end. But
You
what they had to
mentioned,
work with, they think they did a good job. Yeah.
yeah, you mentioned just the logistical challenges of getting to Jonestown. Of course, that is a challenge, the distance and the vast jungle that separates Georgetown from Jonestown. You mentioned a few things that I'd just like to ask about. You mentioned that, the embassy staff, for all of their efforts, to build a good relationship with Jonestown, seems like it didn't succeed. Are you able to, um, remember a particular incident or something happened that could kind of illustrate that, or that could just illustrate, some event, something that happens that illustrates this tense or not very good relationship between the embassy and Jonestown? Does anything come to mind that kind of illustrates that or fleshes that out a little bit?
Uh, sure. For example, there would be agreements that reached to between embassy staff and People's Temple's representatives to meet on a certain date, and these would be canceled at the last minute on the side of Jonestown, uh, or or if we knew that some of the People's Temple members were coming into Georgetown, we'd say, well, do you want to meet on these particular days while you're in town? And they would rebuff those and say, we don't want, we don't trust you. We don't want to we don't want to talk with you. Those sort of things. There were pluses and minuses from the Guyanese perspective too. One, it was a way to uh, prod the U.S. government for more attention by
Mm,
having these dissidents welcomed within their and that here we are, the poor country, and yet we're taking in these outsiders from the U.S. and so on. Things like it
sure.
goes along with their whole the whole narrative that they had developed.
How did what happened at Jonestown, um, November 18, 1978, I think is the day. Um,
Yep.
how did that first come into your consciousness? When did you first become aware that something significant had happened?
Right. Well, on the 18th, I was resting in the evening because knew I was scheduled to have the upcoming midnight shift, which from the 18th to the 19th. So the first time I really knew that there was something going on was when I arrived to stand watch that night for the midnight shift. Drove in, walked in, and it was quite apparent that there was all kinds of crazy going on right there. The Marine that I was leaving from duty passed on the information that there had been some kind of massacre
Mm,
out at the Jonestown on the congressman's entourage. Uh, the embassy was a maelstrom of activity. The Normally on the midnight shift, you're there alone, and you're taking care of various functions that you have to take care of.
Yeah.
Not that that night, everybody was there. Yeah, I mean, for my NCOIC was there, embassy staff, the ambassador, everybody was there. The public affairs officer, and so on, and it was just pandemonium, uh, controlled chaos. As where we were doing triage. Uh,
Mm.
and so I spent that midnight shift dealing with the events as they came in. What we knew at that point was that there had been the slayings at the airstrip at Port Kaituma. We had that communication. We were aware the deputy chief of mission, Mr. Dwyer, that we had brought up before, was still there, and he had sent some communications back to the embassy. That, of course, the congressman had been killed with a number of other people. We knew that, but there were all kinds of things that we did not know at that point. And rumors were swirling around and so forth. One thing we did know was that there were members of the People's Temple in Georgetown also. And so because of that, we were at a high level of alert because we didn't know if this would be part of a concerted effort to attack American interest, regardless of where they were, either in Jonestown or in Georgetown, and whether they might possibly be attacking the embassy.
Well, that's what I
So,
wanted to ask you, is I've, talked to special forces soldier who, arrives in Jonestown very quickly. And he said that when he came in, his assumption going in was that he was heading into a combat situation. He was anticipating being in a firefight. Were you, did that briefly go through your mind that, your role as a Marine might switch from whatever a normal, whatever normal duty is to, actual combat? Were you, in your own mind, were you gearing up for that, for the possibility of that?
well, as embassy Marines live with that in their minds constantly. So, and they are trained and constantly prepared to for that such an eventuality. Um, and embassy Marines they're not an offensive force. They are a reactive force, and we rely for much of the security on the local government to
Mm.
provide the basic security for the embassy. I mean, uh, the local populace is of a mind to overtake the embassy. Well, they're going to overtake the embassy. I mean, there's no question on that.
Mm.
So the embassy Marines are to primarily focus on protecting the personnel and protecting the asset of the embassy. And it's a matter of retreat until it can be unwound, the situation.
Mm.
So we were relying on the local police force to make sure that that no one was coming in, off the street. And of course, we had within the compound itself. I can't really go into all the kinds of things that they do in embassies, but the embassy there was not well situated in terms of physical defense. At that time, the embassy was on Main Street in Guyana. It's since moved to a larger compound, but there were buildings all around it. It was a major thoroughfare. Is just basically a three-story wooden structure. So, yeah,
Mm.
not the easiest to physically defend if it had come to that. But truth be told, I didn't have all that much time to think about that. I mean, I was prepared by training to take care of it if it had come up. But I was busy that night with a lot of things.
How did you spend that evening. So you arrive for duty. The embassy is in a state of chaos. You use the phrase you're in sort of triage, which I assume means, you know, the folks in charge of determining what's the priority, how do we prioritize our responses to what's going on. What did you do? What did your duty end up being that night?
Well, part of the normal duties in after hours is uh, the Marines would answer the phones.
Mhm.
We had a switchboard behind the receptionist desk. It was an old, like 8-line British telecom system. It had little levers on it. Even it was so antiquated. It was almost comical.
Yeah.
So I would answer, answered any calls that came into the embassy that evening, and various special duties that would pop up at any given time to assist in the embassy staff and whatever they're doing. We would take care of. The NCOIC, of course, was there, and so he was liaisoning with the other embassy officials, and from time to time he'd ask, "Well, do this, do that, do the other," and I would, take care of that as quickly as I could. And we're part of the team. So, hey, can you, we're swamped. Can you, you know, go make these copies or something like that? Well, yeah, we're going to do it because
Sure.
that's part of the job. And it was pretty much just a whirlwind of activity the whole night. So, pulling out any particular thing I did and say, well, I did that.
Mhm.
I don't know. It's been, 4 decades. So.
Sure. Um, Now, so are you spending a good part of that first night then manning the phone and are fielding the calls that
Yeah,
I imagine are
yeah.
coming in gradually, and then a tsunami of calls I imagine are going to be coming in?
Well, remember, this is 1978. There were no personal computers. There were no cell phones. It was all landline communications. We were still using teletype terminals.
Mm,
So, and Guyana was pretty much a backward. I mean, if you ask the common person on the street, well, have you heard of Guyana? And they probably haven't. And if they have, and you ask them, well, where's Guyana? They'll probably say it's in Africa, right? I
yeah, that's
mean,
right. Yeah.
this is about as far away psychically as you can get from the out of the.
Sure.
So at that time, we had, as I recall, they had like one trunk line, a cable undersea cable for the whole country going out. So just placing a call out in normal times was difficult.
Mm,
And that night, things were just swamped. Of course, the embassy had its own private channels that it was using. But people like the public affairs officer, well, he was on the phone all night with constant people from back in the United States trying to get information from him and so forth. And I got many calls from members of the press trying to get through to whoever they could talk to, because even though we had very limited information there and we were local back in the United States,
sure.
you're talking about, well, it's like 4 in the morning in back
Mm,
in the West Coast where the People's Temple people were from. And so the press there were trying to get through to Guyana, just diving through and then getting through. And they didn't have a clue about what was going on. And so
wow.
they were just starving for any information.
So these journalists, then, of course, they want to get through to people, in the know who are going to be in positions of authority, decision-making positions. But as you've indicated, those folks are overwhelmed. Did any of the journalists say, well, if I can't talk to anybody else, I'll talk to this Marine? Did you have journalists who wanted to interview you about what you knew?
Yeah, yes, we did. Yes, I did. I can remember phone calls from several local Bay Area television stations. I had one call from the CBS affiliate KPIX in San Francisco. And at the time, the PAO, Mr. Kibble, was not available. He was talking to someone else on another line. And so I explained, this reporter asked to talk to the ambassador. I said, well, no, that ain't happening. Is the PAO there? Contact him. I said, well, he's on the other line right now. He said, well, can I put you on hold? I said, well, I can put you on hold, but I can't tell you, whether you'll lose the connection or not, and I don't know how long he's going to be. And say, well, who else is there? Well, not really anybody, sir. I mean, we're pretty swamped here. So, well, who are you? Well, I explained, well, I'm Marine Guard here on duty here. He said, well, can I talk to you? I said, well, okay, sure. Unless I have something come up that I have to do.
Yeah.
And so I explained to him that I was from the Bay Area and I knew of KPIX, and because he wanted to know who I was. He explained they didn't know what was happening, and of course they had a vital interest of finding out. So he tried to ask me questions about what was going on, and I couldn't say. Because one, I didn't know, and two, I wasn't authorized to make any kind of statements in any way.
Yeah. He said that the embassy was sort of a maelstrom of activity. Over the first 24, 48 hours, do you have a recollection of the embassy, of a lot of people coming into the embassy that you've never seen before? Did you have the feeling that a lot of folks were, coming in from the outside who were in one way or another involved in what was unfolding?
There were a lot of people that were going in and out of the embassy that were, yes, not regulars, but those that came in or out were meeting with somebody, and they would come up, from the embassy staff, and they would be escorted to do whatever they did. So we didn't have to sort out that whether they should be there or not. And I don't know, but I would imagine that many of the local Guyanese officials were probably in and out, and non-officials, people from logistics support that they're trying to get in. Well, you can imagine who was there. We had contingents from you name it, the FBI and State Department officials and military. It is reporters. It was just. You must remember, the embassy there was very small. I mean, if we had 25 people tops before Jonestown, maybe, and 6 of those are Marines. It's not a lot of people.
Yeah.
So, and they had to take care of all of the interests that the United States has in Guyana with 25 people. That's quite a job.
Sure. Yeah. The experience here in the States is that the first reports come in and the numbers grow. And so the newspaper articles, just to kind of pull numbers out of the air, 300. And then the next day, 400. And then the next day, 600. And, and the numbers keep going up. Was the experience similar in the embassy, that as time goes on, do you have a recollection of the initially you just know that something happened on the airstrip at Port Kaituma, and then news comes in though that something's happened at Jonestown. And then as folks get in there and they're dealing with what actually happened, they find, we've got bodies piled on bodies. Was that the experience in the embassy, of just a gradual, just remembering, I guess, a sense of just the growing magnitude of what had happened in Jonestown?
Not really. I mean, we knew the embassy didn't speculate as to how many what the tally was in terms of number of people.
Mm,
They were responsible for finding out. And so we were focused on that. It was clear at the beginning, we first only knew about the airstrip and what had happened there. But as soon as anyone got to Jonestown, it was quite apparent that if there were any survivors at all, it was a few that had somehow escaped into the jungle.
mm, yeah.
And the prospects of that, well, we don't know. We're not going to speculate. And anyone who did get out of that jungle, what were their prospects of surviving? Within the embassy, I don't think anyone was surprised that the vast majority of the people in Jonestown uh, were dead.
Wow. You mentioned in something you wrote that you were in the presence of Richard Dwyer, the deputy chief of mission, who was wounded there at Port Khartoum. And you say in what you wrote that you realized, given what he was saying or given what was happening when you were near him, you realized that you were participating in something. These aren't your exact words, but you're participating in something for the history books. You understood that something was unfolding around you that was going to become part of history. Do you remember what it was said, or what was said, or what it was about that moment that drove that point home to you, that this isn't just a bad day at work, but this is something of historical significance that's taken place?
Yes. Well, the circumstances were that after that first night, we were concerned that there might be attacks on embassy and its personnel. So we initiated bodyguard details for the ambassador.
Mm,
And I was on bodyguard duty that on the evening of the 19th. This is the following evening after the midnight shift with the ambassador. So I was armed and providing personal security for him on that shift. And he went to debrief Mr. Dwyer at his home. Now, I didn't have to come to the realization. It was pretty well obvious that this was a historic time. At that time, we already knew the following. We knew that a congressman, a U.S. congressman, had been shot and killed. The only one ever killed in performance of his congressional duties. That there were other casualties in the press, that there were untold number of others that were expected to be dead in Jonestown. So it was, and I was on bodyguard duty with the ambassador. So it was pretty obvious that this was not,
mm,
this was a historic time. But it was, I was 21 years old. I just turned 21 a couple of months before that.
mm,
And I was with the ambassador. We went to Mr. Dwyer's house, and he had just gotten back from Jonestown. He had a visit from a nurse that it was next door. He still had the bullet in him, and he was debriefing and telling the ambassador what had transpired. He'd been up, remember, the entire previous night, taking care of things at Port Kaituma. And
wow.
I mean, he still had a bullet in him. I mean, he was drugged up. We kept it as brief as possible. The ambassador kept it as brief as
Sure.
possible. But I'm sitting here on the sofa listening to it, and I'm looking back at the fourth. I'm thinking to myself, this is surrealistic. This is mind. What am I
Yeah.
doing here?
Well,
So
that's the word that was in my mind. I was going to ask you. I mean, did it seem surreal that you're you're at the home of a guy who's an important figure in the embassy. You say he's got a bullet in him, and he's just come from this experience, and here he is debriefing. Now, you said that he was drugged a bit. I imagine that was for the pain or something. But
Antibiotics, I think,
oh,
mostly.
okay, okay,
But still.
okay. I mean, how would you describe his own demeanor? Now by 78, I think he had had a pretty extensive career and had been a lot of places in the world. Um, how would you describe him? I mean, how did he come across to you?
Well, it was typical of his character. He was a consummate professional,
Mm,
in my opinion.
yeah,
And he wanted help despite what he was personally going through. And he thought it was important to talk with the ambassador as soon as they can, to tell them as much information as they could as quickly as possible.
you mentioned in something you've written that um, some audio tapes are brought to the embassy, and what they're brought in um, is a body bag, because that was what was available to bring the tapes in. What do you recall about that?
Yes, well, I believe this was on the 20th, although I'm not sure of the date. After the evening visiting Mr. Dwyer, I was back on duty in the embassy at Post One, which is at the front entrance of the embassy.
Yeah.
In walked a U.S. government official, and he was carrying a body bag, a canvas body bag, and he sees me on the post. He says, "Hang on to this. I'll be back for it, and don't mention it. Don't tell anybody about it. Keep it calm."
Hmm.
And, yes, sir. And so I put it behind the post and underneath, and I could see that inside it was open. There were the boxes for open reels of audio tape, reel to reel tape, audio tape.
Yeah.
But I could also detect the strong odor of the body bag having been used, and it had the odor of a decomposed body had been in it, which is a very powerful for anyone who's ever had occasion for smelling something like, of that. Um, so that's okay. This is one more thing on the list. I would want to get this thing out of here as soon as I can, quite frankly, because But while I'm standing there, anyone walking into the front door of the embassy could smell this powerful, overpowering odor. And some of them had a quizzical comment, didn't comment and walked on through, but others would ask, well, what's that smell? And you can't say anything because you don't want to call attention to the fact that there's something here, and they don't have a need to know, and it would make my job harder if people knew that this thing was here, right? Because suppose okay, something's come up and I got whatever. Now people know this thing is here. I have to take special care to protect it or handle it until this guy comes back to get it. So I had to pretty much stand there, pretending I didn't know what was going on while people were filing in. And fortunately, the guy came back for the bag after only a short while, maybe 10 or 20 minutes, something like that.
I see. So he told you don't tell anybody about the bag. So, because I was curious about that, because you had written that as people are asking, what is that smell, that you pretended not to know what they were talking about. And so what I'm hearing now is that the reason you did that is because this guy said, don't tell anybody about it. And so
Mm,
then your way of,
I don't know. I don't know if he explicitly said that or he just said, "Hey, I know he said, just, hey, you hang on to this." But the implication was there was that, hey, this is sensitive stuff, and he wouldn't have had to have told me. I would have picked up on say, okay, this is, keep this on the QT and don't, it's a need to know basis. People don't need to know about this. And that's the way that's the way I handled it.
so you're acting in a very professional way. Um, how would you describe the the impact of all of this on you? And I guess there are two parts of that question. One is immediately, you show up for work, just assuming that it's going to be a night shift like the previous night shift, and everything has been overturned, and now you realize that you're part of this huge story that's unfolding that people are still going to be talking about decades later, making documentaries about decades later, and you're conducting yourself in a very professional way. But how did all of this impact you as an individual? Let's say a few days go by, your shift is over, you are by yourself now, and you're beginning that process of working through all this stuff in your mind. What was the impact on you in the short term? And then I'm also interested in how has all of this lived with you since. So how did it impact you in the short term?
In the short term, it was a lot of extra work because
Mm,
we immediately went on to double shifts. We were 8 on, 8 off, 8 on, 8 off for a couple of weeks, which, is tiring. You can
exhausting,
only do
yeah.
that so long. And we were in uh, urgent mode. Uh, we had urgent things to take care of, so we focused on that and set aside for reflection later about other things. For example, in all of this activity, I didn't contact my parents, for about a week
Mm,
afterwards. Finally, my mom called me because she was worried about, what's going on, and I talked to
sure.
her. I'd asked the one of the reporters who I'd had on the phone if he could contact my parents because knowing how bad communications were, but unfortunately he hadn't done that. So personal things were put aside. That was compartmentalized. You have to focus on the job right now. Um, but as time went on and I had time to reflect personally, I became more convinced that people need to be dealt with compassionately and to be given the benefit of the doubt.
Mm.
Uh, not know you don't know what someone's gone through, and you don't know why they're acting a particular way. I don't assume that people are when somebody slights me in some way or does me wrong. I've because of things that happened then and other things in life, I've just come to the realization that it's probably not because of me. It's probably because of something they're dealing with. And to give them the same kind of leeway that I would hope to have. Uh,
So
yeah, it makes me more empathetic with other people, I would say.
it sounds like you're describing a kind of grace, cutting other people slack. And here's how I'm interpreting what you're saying, and then I'm interested in hearing your response. In the immediate aftermath of Jonestown, I have a recollection of this just as a kid, just picking things up on TV. The impression I had as a kid, listening, to newscasts and things, was that these were brainwashed automatons, human, but not quite. I know that there's resistance in communities to having, their bodies buried in certain American communities. And there's this sense of, these crazed KoolAid drinkers, in Jonestown. That's sort of the idea. And then what you do is you actually watch the video and you listen to the tapes and you read what a lot of these folks wrote, and what you find out is that they're human beings just like the human beings you bump into all the time. And they're not what they don't fit. The people you actually meet don't fit the description of what I as a kid had in my mind based on what I was picking up from news reports. Is that what you're saying? Just the recognition that it's important to cut people slack because we don't know what it was that attracted them to this movement. We don't know what the psychological conditions were that got them into this situation. And therefore a certain degree, and also we don't know that had we been in the same conditions, in the same context, we can't be sure that we would not have done the exact same thing, because after all, we're pretty much like they were as human beings. And that's where the sense of grace comes from. So I just threw a lot at you, but that's my interpretation of what you said. Does that fit with what you're thinking?
Yeah, there's a lot of what you were describing is I, I agree with a lot of those things. I think that it, it mostly I feel sadness
Mhm.
at the loss. Um, and I try to ask myself, what can I learn from this
Mhm.
to prevent others from making similar mistakes? I can't change what happened. So second best is what can we do to
Mhm.
salvage what we can from lessons we can from this. Um, it's there's a lot more compassion needed than goes around. That's for sure.
There's that phrase, and I saw you responded to it when you referred to this idea of drinking the Kool-Aid. And I think it's a trivial thing, but it's flavor aid. Actually, it's not Kool-Aid. That's a trivial point. But
Yeah, right.
um, that phrase is around, but I think each day that goes by, fewer and fewer people really get the reference. It's just become a phrase, don't drink the Kool-Aid. But you're
Yeah.
among the small number of people in the world who has a pretty close sense of what that phrase is about. And of course, there are other people who have a much closer sense. You're a Marine at the embassy, so there's some distance, but compared to the vast majority of us, you're much closer than the
Mm.
overwhelming majority of us. When you hear that phrase, um, does it not bother you at all? Does it just go by you? Does it bother you when you hear people use that phrase?
Well, yes, but um, later in life, I became a public school teacher, and during history classes at high schools, uh, when the people use or when I'm talking with grown-ups and they come up and use that expression of Kool-Aid drinkers, I've been able to use that as an opportunity to share with them um, and overcome some of the ignorance about it. Flavor Aid, which is, of course, I think you and I both know that it was Flavor Aid, not Kool-Aid.
Yeah.
They weren't Kool-Aid drinkers at Jonestown, because remember that many of the victims there, and I use the word victim because these were really victims, were children who were not voluntarily drinking this. They were given this by those that they trusted. In some cases, their own parents. So it's rather callous to describe all of the victims of Jonestown and put them in with those few true believers who voluntarily took it upon themselves to commit suicide. Because there was enormous amounts of coercion and some that were completely involuntary or incapable of giving consent. So it's a disparagement to their memory to talk about it that way. And but I can't blame the vast majority of people who are ignorant of those things. And I wouldn't want to. I'd rather just take the opportunity to educate them.